Before I tell you what happened that afternoon, I just want to say, every time I sit here and talk to you all, it feels like I'm having coffee with friends scattered all across the country. So, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? I always love seeing the comments. Texas, Ohio, little towns I've never even heard of. And if you're new here, welcome. Go ahead and subscribe if you like stories that make you feel something real, and hit that little like button. It helps more than you know. All right, now let me tell you about the day my neighbor's son stepped quietly into my living room, and how everything changed in ways I didn't expect. It was one of those long, soft afternoons where the light in the house seemed to slow time down. The kind of light that turns dust into gold and makes the old furniture look almost sentimental. I'd been sitting on the edge of the sofa, half folding laundry, half listening to the sound of the wind brushing through the birch trees outside. My house always felt too quiet around that hour. Since my husband passed 5 years ago, the silence sometimes felt like a second skin, familiar but heavy. I'd met Daniel, my neighbor's son, plenty of times before. He grew up across the street, the kind of polite young man who'd always wave or offer to carry my groceries. He must be 30 now, maybe 31. His parents had gone away for a few weeks, and I'd promised to water their plants. Nothing unusual about that. But that afternoon, he came over on his own, saying he needed to borrow something from his parents' shed, and before I knew it, he was standing just inside my living room doorway, hesitating a little, like he wasn't sure if he should stay or go. I looked up from the basket of laundry and smiled. "You can come in, you know. I don't bite." My voice probably came out softer than I meant it to. He grinned, that half-boyish grin that made the lines around his eyes crease in a way that felt genuine. He took a few steps inside, and for some reason, the air in the room seemed to shift, just slightly. We talked about simple things at first: the weather, his parents' trip, how the neighborhood felt quieter than usual. He noticed a framed photo on my coffee table, one of me and my late husband from our anniversary trip. He picked it up carefully. "You look really happy here," he said. I smiled, remembering. We were. That was in Savannah. We got lost every single day, and somehow it was always my fault. He laughed softly, setting the photo back down as though it were something fragile. There was kindness in his eyes, not pity, not the hollow kind of sympathy people give out of habit, but something warmer, like understanding. We ended up sitting down across from each other. I poured him some iced tea, the kind with mint from my small garden. The glass clinked gently as he set it on the table. I could tell he was looking around, taking in the quiet details of my home: the faded curtains, the old piano that hadn't been tuned in years, the faint scent of lemon polish and lavender. "Your house feels." He paused, searching for the right word. "Peaceful." I nodded, then said, "Sometimes peace feels a lot like loneliness." That hung in the air between us. He looked at me, really looked, and for the first time I noticed something different about him. How much he'd changed since the boy I remembered mowing his parents' lawn. There was a calmness about him, but also a sort of restlessness beneath it, like someone still figuring out where he belonged in the world. He asked about my husband then, gently, and I found myself telling him stories I hadn't shared in years. The kind you don't plan to tell, they just slip out. About the little things, how my husband used to hum while fixing things around the house, how he'd always leave the radio on too loud when he cooked breakfast. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression open, sincere. I hadn't realized how much I missed being listened to like that. Not out of obligation, but out of genuine curiosity. It made me feel seen again, something I hadn't felt in a long time. At one point, he got up to look at a painting on the wall, a small watercolor I'd done years ago. "You painted this?" he asked, surprised. I said, back when I still believed in chasing hobbies. "It's beautiful," he said simply. "You should paint again." The way he said it, without judgment, without expectation, hit me harder than I wanted to admit. It's funny how a few kind words can stir something that's been asleep inside you for years. Outside, the sky had started to shift into the soft tones of early evening. The light coming through the curtains made everything in the room glow faintly amber. I realized I hadn't thought about the time once during our talk. We sat there, comfortable in the quiet. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. He glanced around again, almost shyly, and said, "You've built something warm here. I hope I have that someday." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I just smiled and said, "You will." And I meant it. When he finally stood up to leave, he hesitated at the door again, the same way he had when he first came in. "Thank you for letting me stay a while," he said. "I didn't realize how much I needed to slow down today." I told him he was welcome anytime. And as he walked back across the street, the sun just starting to dip behind the trees, I stood there by the window, feeling something unfamiliar, something between gratitude and ache. That night, when I sat down with a cup of tea, the living room still held traces of his presence, the faint impression on the cushion, the glass ring on the coaster, the soft echo of our laughter. It made the silence feel different. Not heavy this time, just quiet. And I remember thinking, maybe that's what connection really is. Not fireworks, not grand moments, but something quieter. Something that reminds you you're still alive. I didn't know it then, but that small visit would be the beginning of a change I didn't see coming. A change that would make me confront the parts of myself I'd tucked away for too long. But that came later. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying little moments from the afternoon, the way the sunlight had caught the side of his face, the calm tone of his voice when he'd asked about my paintings, and the simple warmth in his smile when he said goodbye. It wasn't anything dramatic. It wasn't even something I could name. It was just a feeling I hadn't felt in years, the kind that lingers quietly, reminding you that you're still capable of feeling something deeply, even when you thought that part of your life had long passed. The next morning, the world looked the same, but I felt a little different. I poured my coffee and stood by the window, looking across the street toward his parents' house. Their curtains were still drawn, the front yard neat as ever, and the sound of a lawnmower buzzed faintly somewhere down the block. It was an ordinary day, but there was this odd flutter of anticipation I couldn't quite explain. By noon, I decided to bake. I hadn't done that in ages. Maybe it was habit, or maybe just an excuse to keep my hands busy. I pulled out the old recipe for lemon loaf, one my husband used to love, and soon the kitchen filled with the smell of citrus and sugar. The house felt alive again somehow. I was just about to set the loaf to cool when I heard a gentle knock at the door. My heart jumped a little, though I told myself not to be silly. When I opened it, there he was, Daniel, wearing a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, a small streak of sawdust on his arm. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," he said. "I was working on something in the garage, and Mom mentioned you might still have their spare key. I didn't want to bother you, but—" "You're not bothering me," I said quickly, maybe too quickly. "Come in." He stepped inside, wiping his hands on a rag he brought with him, and I caught the faint smell of wood and oil on him. It was strange how familiar it felt, comforting, even. He noticed the lemon loaf cooling on the counter and smiled. "That smells amazing." I laughed softly. It's been a while since I baked. I figured the kitchen was starting to forget what warmth felt like. He tilted his head, studying me for a moment. "You're too hard on yourself. This place feels like warmth the second you step in." I tried to brush it off, but the compliment lingered. We ended up sitting at the kitchen table with 2 slices of the loaf, sharing them like it was a small ritual. He told me about the furniture piece he was building for his parents, a cedar bench for their porch, and how he'd started doing woodworking during the pandemic to stay sane. I found myself genuinely fascinated, watching how his hands moved when he talked, the way his eyes lit up when he described shaping something from nothing. "You've always been good with your hands," I said, smiling. He chuckled. "You remember that? I used to fix the fence for my dad every summer. Guess I never really stopped." The conversation flowed easily after that, effortless, like water running downhill. I realized how rare that was for me lately. Most of my conversations these days were brief, polite exchanges with neighbors or cashiers. Nothing that made me feel truly connected, but with him there was no rush, no script. When I offered him another slice of cake, he looked at me and said softly, "You know, you don't talk like most people around here. You really listen." His words caught me off guard. I think that's just what happens when you spend a lot of time alone. You learn to listen to everything: the walls, the rain, your own thoughts. He nodded, then said, "Maybe that's what people like me need to learn too." There was something in his voice when he said it, a quiet honesty, maybe even weariness. I could tell he'd been through his share of disappointments, though he didn't say much. And I didn't pry. Sometimes understanding doesn't need words. The afternoon stretched on, soft and unhurried. I showed him my little garden out back, the one I'd neglected for too long. He crouched down to touch the soil, telling me how I could revive it easily if I wanted to. "You've still got good roots here," he said, glancing up at me. "You just need a little sunlight again." I laughed, though his words hit deeper than I let on. Maybe I do. When he stood up, our eyes met for a moment longer than usual. It wasn't awkward, just quiet, still, meaningful. There was no need to fill it with small talk. The wind rustled through the lilac bushes, carrying the scent of earth and memory. We went back inside, and as he reached for his keys, he hesitated. "Would you maybe want to come by sometime? I could show you what I'm working on in the garage. It's nothing fancy, but you might like it." I felt a small, unfamiliar thrill at the invitation. "I'd like that," I said, smiling. After he left, I stood at the kitchen counter, tracing the faint crumb marks left on his plate. It was such a simple afternoon, but somehow it left the house feeling alive in a way it hadn't been in years. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of gold and rose, I walked out onto the porch and looked across the street. His garage light was still on. Through the half-open door, I could see him bent over a workbench, focused, steady, humming to himself. And I realized then, what had begun as a quiet visit was becoming something else. Something neither of us had planned for, but both seemed to need. It wasn't about romance or longing. It was about connection, about being reminded that even at 60, life still has surprises left in it. As the crickets started their nightly chorus, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea and whispered to myself, maybe this is how healing begins, not with noise or promises, but with a knock on the door and the courage to let someone in. I didn't know it yet, but that small invitation to visit his workshop would open a new chapter of my life, one I hadn't dared to imagine in years. A few days later, I found myself standing outside Daniel's garage, the late afternoon sun spilling across the driveway like honey. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and pine, and from inside came the steady rhythm of a hammer, soft, patient, almost musical. I hesitated for a moment, smoothing my hands against my skirt as if I needed to prepare myself for something. It felt strange, this flutter of anticipation. At 60, you don't expect to feel nervous about visiting someone's workshop. Yet there I was, heart quietly racing like a girl half my age. When I stepped inside, he looked up from his workbench and smiled. "You made it." I said I would. I replied, trying to sound casual, though my voice came out a little warmer than I intended. The place was neat in its own way. Organized chaos. Wooden boards leaned against the far wall, and the scent of varnish mixed with the earthy smell of cedar. The afternoon light streamed in through the high windows, catching the dust in golden trails. He was building something. A long wooden bench, half-sanded, its grain catching the light like ripples on water. "It's beautiful," I said, stepping closer. "You really did this yourself?" "Every piece," he said, brushing off a bit of sawdust. "I started working with wood after I realized how much peace it gives me. You can't rush it. It teaches you patience." He handed me a small piece of sandpaper. "Here, try it." I laughed. "I haven't done this in my life." "Then it's a good day to start," he said. I took the sandpaper and ran it gently across the smooth surface. The motion felt grounding, rhythmic, almost soothing. There was something deeply satisfying about watching the surface change under my touch. For a moment, we didn't talk. There was only the soft scrape of sandpaper and the hum of cicadas outside. He glanced at me. "You've got a good hand," he said. I smiled. Maybe I've just spent too many years polishing furniture instead of creating it. He chuckled, then said, "Creation starts small. You just need to give yourself permission again." That word, permission, stayed with me. After a while, he offered me a glass of water, and we sat on 2 old stools near the open garage door. The light was shifting, turning softer, the shadows longer. He told me about his job. How he'd left an office position he hated, how his parents thought he was crazy for trading spreadsheets for wood shavings. But he said this, the work, made him feel human again. I listened, really listened, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was hearing something that mattered. When he turned the question to me, "What about you? What makes you feel alive these days?" I didn't know what to say. I opened my mouth, then closed it. Finally, I said, "I used to paint, but I stopped after my husband passed. It felt wrong somehow, like color didn't belong to me anymore." He nodded thoughtfully, not pushing, just waiting. Then he said quietly, "Maybe it's time you took it back." I looked at him, surprised. "You say that like it's easy." He shrugged, smiling gently. "It's not, but the hardest things usually turn out to be the most worth it." Something about the way he said it, steady without judgment, made my throat tighten. It wasn't pity, it was belief. And I realized how long it had been since someone believed in me simply because they wanted to. We sat there as the sun sank behind the rooftops, and the sky turned the color of old rose petals. The silence between us was comfortable now, almost familiar. I could feel the soft evening air on my skin, the faint hum of life all around us. When I finally stood to leave, he walked me to the edge of the driveway. "You know," he said, "I'd love to see one of your paintings someday." I laughed lightly. "You'd have to dig them out from the back of my closet." "Then I guess that's where we'll start," he said with an easy grin. As I walked back home, his words echoed in my mind. I thought about the closet in the guest room, the one filled with old canvases, brushes stiff from neglect, colors sealed away in forgotten jars. That night, I opened it for the first time in years. The smell of old paint and turpentine hit me like a memory. I pulled out a small canvas, dusted it off, and set it on the table. My hands trembled slightly as I unscrewed the cap from a tube of blue paint. The color was rich and alive, almost defiant. I hesitated, brush hovering in the air, and then, almost without thinking, I made the first stroke. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even pretty. But it was mine. Hours slipped by unnoticed. By the time I stepped back, my heart felt light, almost buoyant. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed this. The quiet focus, the intimacy of creation, the dialogue between the brush and my thoughts. When I finally went to bed, the half-finished painting rested on the easel, catching the moonlight through the curtain. I fell asleep smiling for the first time in months. The next morning, I woke early, made some coffee, and found myself glancing toward the window across the street. Daniel's truck was parked out front, and for a moment, I thought about going over, showing him what I'd done. But I stopped myself. Not yet. Some things need to settle before they're shared. Still, as the day went on, I caught myself humming the way I used to when life felt full. It wasn't that Daniel had changed me. No, it was more that he reminded me I could still change myself. And as I stood there, brush in hand, painting as the morning light poured into my quiet living room, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope. I didn't know it then, but the next time I saw him, that hope would be tested in ways I couldn't have imagined. The next week passed in a gentle blur of small routines and quiet discoveries. I painted every morning now, sometimes losing track of time completely. My hands were streaked with color again, little smudges of blue and ochre, the kind that used to frustrate me but now felt like proof that I was living. The house had changed too. It didn't echo the same way anymore. It carried a hum, faint but alive, like a heartbeat. Daniel hadn't come by for a few days, and though I didn't want to admit it, I found myself glancing out the window more often than usual. His parents had returned from their trip, and I saw him helping them unload bags, fixing something on the porch. He looked up once and caught my eye from across the street. He smiled, an easy, familiar smile, and lifted his hand in a small wave. I waved back, feeling that same quiet flutter I couldn't name. 2 days later, I was in the garden when he walked over, hands tucked into his pockets. The air smelled faintly of rain, and the sky was heavy with clouds that promised a storm. "Hey," he said, his voice worn as ever. "I saw your lights on late the other night. Been painting again?" I laughed softly. "You noticed." "I notice a lot more than you think," he said, then added quickly, "in a good way." I invited him in, and we stood together in the living room, the faint smell of turpentine still lingering in the air. My latest painting sat on the easel, unfinished but full of color and motion. He studied it quietly for a while before speaking. "This is beautiful," he said finally. "You've brought something back to life here." I felt a warmth rise in my chest. Maybe it was never gone. Maybe I just forgot where I left it. He smiled, then turned to me. "Would you ever think about showing your work? Maybe a local exhibit or something?" I shook my head. "Oh no, I'm far too old for that sort of thing." He looked at me, a little puzzled. "You say that like age has anything to do with creating. You've got something people would want to feel, not just see." Something about the way he said it, soft, steady, sincere, made me pause. I'd spent so many years shrinking myself, telling the world I'd already lived the parts that mattered, and here was someone reminding me that there were still new beginnings, even after 60. The rain started to fall outside, gentle at first, then steady. It drummed softly on the roof, filling the pauses between our words. I poured us tea, and we sat by the window, watching the world blur through the streaks of rain. He told me about his plans to open a small woodworking studio in town, maybe even teach a few classes. "I don't know if it'll work," he admitted, "but I'm tired of waiting for perfect conditions. Sometimes you just have to start." His words struck a chord in me. I realized we were both learning the same thing, that life doesn't end when things change. It begins again in a quieter, braver way. When the rain eased, he stood to leave. "You should come by the studio once I get it set up," he said. "Maybe hang one of your paintings on the wall." I smiled. "I'll hold you to that." He hesitated at the door for a moment, then said, "You know, I used to think wisdom came with age, but I'm starting to believe it comes from people who've lived honestly. You've taught me that." His words caught me off guard, and for a second I couldn't speak. I just nodded, feeling a quiet ache that was somehow both sweet and sad. After he left, I stood by the window, watching him cross the street, rain glistening on his shoulders. My reflection looked back at me in the glass. Older, yes, but softer too. There was something different in my eyes, something I hadn't seen there in a long time: peace. That night, I finished the painting I'd been working on. It was a landscape, not of a place I'd ever been, but one that lived inside me. A field of golden light, a winding path leading toward a distant horizon. When I signed my name at the bottom, my hand trembled, not from age, but from meaning. I hung it in the living room, above the fireplace where my husband's photo used to be. It wasn't about replacing the past. It was about honoring it while still making space for what was to come. A week later, Daniel invited me to see his studio. The walls smelled of fresh paint and wood, sunlight pouring through wide windows. My painting hung there, just as he'd promised, catching the light in a way that made it look alive. He'd carved a small sign beneath it that read, "For those who find beauty again." When I saw it, I couldn't speak. I just stood there, tears pricking the corners of my eyes. He looked at me, smiling quietly, and in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Connection isn't always about who stays or who leaves. It's about the moments that remind you you're still part of the world. Months have passed since then. I still paint. Sometimes Daniel stops by for tea, sometimes not. But it doesn't matter, because what began as a quiet visit from my neighbor's son became a reminder that life, in all its quiet turns, keeps finding ways to surprise you. And as I sit here tonight, telling you this, I can't help but smile. So, wherever you're watching from, whether it's a small town in Iowa or a city apartment in New York, remember this: it's never too late to open the door again. If this story made you feel something, hope, peace, maybe even a spark of your own, don't forget to leave a comment, let me know where you're from, and subscribe for more stories like this. Because life isn't over at 60. Sometimes it's just beginning.